Hello, Accelerated Math 6-7 students. We are beginning Module 3, Lesson 2. And if we turn into my table of contents, Module 3, Lesson 2 is the opposite of a number, and it can be found on page 53 in my comp book. So I'm going to turn to that now. So here we go. The opposite of a number. Okay. Today, we will work with the opposite of a number and what that means. The question that I want you to be thinking about is, what does the word opposite mean? Okay. I have a little kind of fun activity that I want to do with you with this, and it's called What is the Opposite? So we're going to take a look at that, and you need to write in your notes what is the opposite of each of these things. So what is the opposite of hot? Please write that next to it. What is the opposite of summer? What is the opposite of salt? What is the opposite of in? And what is the opposite of up? And what is opposite of the word left? Now, some of you are sitting here going, Mrs. Nelson, this is math. Well, the reason why I want you to do that is because in math, the opposite is very similar to that. You have to find the number that would represent the opposite of another number. And the best way to think about that is if we look back at our number line that we were discovering in yesterday's lesson, we had the number line with the 0, and then on either side, the numbers matched up together. The only difference is on the right-hand side of the 0, it was positive. On the left-hand side of the 0, it was negative. So in math, opposite number values are in the same position on the number line, except for they're on the left or the right of the 0. And so I was trying to get your mind thinking about what would the opposite be. Going into that idea a little bit further, talking about 0, we know that 0 is special. The reason why 0 is special is because 0 is its own opposite. It doesn't have one. 0 is 0 is 0. It is not positive or negative, and 0 is the starting point for all numbers. So when you're starting to use the number line to add, subtract, multiply, divide, you always start at 0 because that's the starting point. So let's take a look at this number line right here. We have just a very plain number line going in both directions forever. That's what those two arrows signify, is that it never stops. And 0 happens to be smack dab in the middle. The distance from 0 determines the opposites. So if I go 2 hops to the right, then I'm sitting at positive 2. Well, the opposite of that would be 2 hops to the left, which would be negative 2. So distance from 0 determines the opposites. What is the opposite of these numbers? I need you to write them down right now. So I would like you to tell me what is the opposite of 5, what is the opposite of negative 10, what is the opposite of negative 3, what is the opposite of 15, and what would be the opposite of negative 100. Okay, and so you need to get those down for me. Again, we're working with the opposite of a number and what that means. So hopefully this is helping you to understand that. So now we're going to look at this next thing, changing the page. What would happen when you take the opposite of 2 and then the opposite of that number that was the opposite of 2? And now I know that gets kind of confusing, so let's say it again. What would happen when you take the opposite of 2, hopefully all of you have that number in your head right now, then you take the opposite of that number that's in your head. So let's write it down and see what happens. So if we take the opposite of 2, we get negative 2. And then when we take the opposite of negative 2, we get 2 again. Okay, so look at it. We have the number, its opposite, and the opposite of the opposite. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Okay, so now let's try another one. What happens when you take the opposite of 8, so hopefully you have that in your head right now, and then you take the opposite of that number? What would you get? Okay, write it down. We have 8. The opposite of 8 is negative 8. The opposite of negative 8 is 8 again. So the number, its opposite, and then we have the opposite of the opposite. Okay, let's see if it works with negatives the same way. So you take the opposite of negative 5, which hopefully you have that in your head right now. Then you take the opposite of that number. So negative 5 is what we started with. The opposite of negative 5 is 5. And the opposite of the opposite is negative 5. So we have that. Now, the reason why some of you are going, oh my gosh, why is she making me do this? Well, the reason that I'm making you do this is because there's a rule. And the rule that you need to know and you need to be aware of and how to use is, so we can say that the opposite of an opposite is the number itself. Okay? And the way we write that algebraically or with symbols is we say, okay, here is the number itself. So it's a negative number, negative A. If you take the opposite of the opposite, you're multiplying it by another negative. So the opposite of an opposite gives you the opposite. Does that make sense? I know it's very confusing. When we plug numbers in there, you're actually going to see what it means. So let's try a couple. What if I gave you, hold on, I have to get a piece of paper. What if I told you that I would like you to take the opposite of 2. So let's say the number is 2. So here is 2. So you have to say, what is the opposite of the opposite? You're going to say the opposite of the number is negative 2. And then the opposite of that gives me 2 again. Okay? So that's why we write it that way. The number was 2. You take the opposite of 2, you get negative 2. You take the opposite of that opposite, and you're back to the number itself. Okay? So the opposite of the opposite is always the number itself. So that's why we have the opposite of A would be negative A. Take the opposite of that, and you get A again. Okay? So the original number on this one is A. All right? You take the opposite of that, you get negative A. You take the opposite of that, and you get back to A again. So that's how this little thing works. The practice that we're going to do in the lesson is going to help you understand that a little bit more, because there's a couple of fun activities that we do with it where you really have to pay attention to what the directions say, because they have you do stuff like that. So look forward to that when we get to there. Let's go back and make sure that we covered our goal for our lesson today. Today we will work with the opposite of a number and what that means. Okay? Remember to use the number line if you're getting confused, because the number line is a very, very good representation of opposites and the numbers. What does the word opposite mean? That's kind of a hard thing to define without using the word, but I would like to see if you can do it. All right, my dears, that's all that I've got for this lesson. I hope that it was clear, and we'll do some practice with it tomorrow. Okay, I'll see you then. Bye.